Max sat beside the kitten, its tiny body trembling in his hands as its temperature continued to rise. Each breath it took grew more shallow and labored. He held it tightly, feeling its fur grow colder with every passing moment, and every movement of the kitten seemed weaker, more lifeless. Panic surged through Max as he fumbled for his phone, his fingers trembling so badly he could barely dial. He screamed into the receiver, pleading for the vet to help, but his thoughts were a jumble and fear gripped him more tightly with every second that passed. Then, as though in answer to his silent prayers, the kitten took one deep breath and suddenly went still. Its tiny body stopped moving. Max froze, his heart stopping in his chest. He shook the kitten, but inside, all he could feel was the terrifying certainty. He might lose it right here, right now, and there was nothing more he could do. Chapter 1. A faint cry in the dark. Max shivered as he stepped into the dimly lit basement. The cold, musty air wrapped around him, carrying the scent of damp concrete and forgotten things. He wasn't sure what had drawn him down there. Maybe curiosity, maybe boredom. But as soon as he reached the last step, he froze. A faint, pitiful sound echoed through the darkness. A meow. Barely audible, weak, and desperate. Max's heart skipped a beat. He strained his ears, trying to locate the source. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, dusty boxes, and rusting pipes running along the ceiling. Shadows stretched and shifted as a single flickering light bulb swayed slightly overhead. Another meow. This time, it sounded even weaker. Carefully, Max picked his way through the basement, stepping over broken floor tiles and stacks of forgotten newspapers. The sound guided him deeper, past an old wooden cabinet and a pile of discarded rags. Then he saw it. Curled up in a tangle of dust-covered wires and cardboard scraps lay a tiny kitten. Max crouched down, his breath catching in his throat. The kitten was barely more than skin and bones, its fur matted and dull. Its eyes, clouded and half-closed, barely flickered in recognition of his presence. It didn't even flinch at his shadow falling over it. Max hesitated. He had found stray kittens before, playful and quick to dart away. But this one, it wasn't moving. Not even to try and escape. His chest tightened. "Hey there, little guy," he whispered, extending his hand slowly. The kitten let out the weakest sound yet, barely more than a whimper. Max gently touched its tiny body. Cold. Too cold. His stomach twisted. He knew enough about animals to understand. If it was this cold, this weak, it didn't have much time left. A wave of determination surged through him. He couldn't leave it here. Quickly, he shrugged off his hoodie and carefully wrapped the kitten in it. The little creature barely reacted, only shivering slightly as Max lifted it into his arms. He cradled it against his chest, feeling its fragile body tremble. "It's okay. I've got you." The moment felt almost surreal. Just minutes ago, he had been aimlessly wandering downstairs, and now, he was holding a life in his hands. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Someone was upstairs. Max's breath hitched. If it was his mom or dad, they would ask questions. And he wasn't sure he had the answers yet. Holding the kitten close, he turned toward the stairs, listening. The footsteps moved slowly, then stopped. A door creaked. Max felt his pulse quicken. He had to get upstairs before anyone saw him, before they could tell him to put the kitten back, before they could say it wasn't his responsibility. Taking a deep breath, he tightened his grip on the tiny bundle in his arms and started up the stairs, his heart pounding with every step. Chapter 2. The First Challenge. Max pressed the tiny bundle closer to his chest as he climbed the stairs, his heart hammering. The kitten was so still, its frail body barely stirring beneath the fabric of his hoodie. He could feel the faintest tremor against his skin, a reminder of how weak it was. As he reached the top of the stairs, he hesitated for a moment, listening. The house was quiet. Good. With slow, careful steps, he moved toward his room, trying to ignore the nagging thought that he had no idea what to do next. The kitten needed help, real help. But how was he supposed to give it? He had almost made it to his door when... Max. He froze. His mother's voice came from the kitchen. Crap. He turned just in time to see her step into the hallway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her eyes narrowed the moment she saw him. What are you hiding? Max swallowed hard. Nothing. Mom tilted her head, giving him that look, the one that told him she knew he was lying. Before he could stop her, she took a step closer. Then the kitten moved. Just a tiny twitch beneath his hoodie. But it was enough. Mom's eyes widened. Max, what? And then it happened. A faint, pitiful meow. Max winced. Busted. His mom sighed, crossing her arms. Maxwell Carter, tell me you did not just bring an animal into this house. Before he could respond, another voice came from behind him. What's going on, Dad? Max turned to see his father emerging from the living room. His brow furrowed. His gaze flicked from Max to Mom, then down to the bundle in Max's arms. Silence stretched between them. Max took a deep breath and unzipped his hoodie just enough to reveal the kitten's tiny, shivering form. His mom inhaled sharply. His dad's frown deepened. Max. Mom's voice was softer now, but still firm. That kitten looks sick. I know, Max admitted. That's why I had to bring it home. Dad ran a hand over his face. Max, we've talked about this. We don't have time for a pet. It's not a pet, Max shot back. It's barely alive. If I left it there, it would have died. Mom sighed, rubbing her temples. Max, I understand, but this kitten needs serious care. What if it has something contagious? What if it doesn't make it? Max's stomach twisted. He knew it was a risk. But the thought of walking away, of doing nothing, it wasn't an option. I'll take care of it, he said quickly. I'll do everything. You won't even notice it's here. Dad shook his head. That's not the point. It's a big responsibility, Max. It's not just about feeding it for a few days. I know that. Max's voice cracked. But I couldn't just leave it. His parents exchanged a look. One of those silent conversations that always made him nervous. Then Mom exhaled, folding her arms again. Max. I'm sorry. But we can't keep it. His heart plummeted. What? No, you don't understand. I do, she said softer now. And I know you mean well. But we have to be realistic. Dad nodded. You need to take it to a shelter, Max. They'll know what to do. No, the word came out before he could stop it. His parents blinked. Max's hands tightened around the kitten, feeling its tiny body tremble. The shelter? No. That wasn't an option. His mind raced. If they wouldn't let him keep it out in the open, then he'd have to do it in secret. His chest tightened as he forced himself to nod. Okay, he said quickly. I'll take it to a shelter tomorrow. His parents studied him for a long moment. Finally, Mom sighed. All right. But tonight, it stays in the garage. No bringing it inside, understand? Max hesitated. He should have argued, should have fought back. But he could already tell their decision was final. Yeah, he mumbled. Mom gave him one last searching look before walking back to the kitchen. Dad lingered for a second, then shook his head and followed. As soon as they were gone, Max let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Then, without another second of hesitation, he turned and slipped into his room, closing the door behind him. The kitten let out a weak meow as he set it gently on his bed. Max sat down beside it, running a hand through his hair. He had no idea what he was doing. But one thing was certain. He wasn't giving up on this kitten. Chapter 3. Battle for Life. Max sat cross-legged on his bed, staring at the tiny creature curled up on his hoodie. The kitten hadn't moved much since he brought it in. Its frail body shivered from time to time, but what worried Max most was how still it was, like it barely had the strength to exist. He had placed an old towel on his bed to make a nest for it, but the kitten showed no signs of comfort. It remained motionless, its tiny ribs rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Max frowned. "Come on, little guy," he murmured. "You have to fight." But the kitten didn't respond. A deep unease settled in his stomach. He knew animals needed food and warmth to survive, but this one was too weak even to lift its head. His mind raced. What was he supposed to do? He couldn't just sit here and hope it would get better. Then he remembered something he had read once about sick animals. How warmth was the most important thing for their survival. Without thinking, he scooped up the kitten and cupped it gently in his hands, pulling it against his chest. Its body was like ice. A pang of fear shot through him. He shifted so that he could hold it securely in both hands, rubbing its tiny sides with his fingers, trying to transfer some of his warmth. The kitten let out the faintest mewl, barely audible, then went still again. Max swallowed hard. Was it too late? No. He refused to believe that. He pulled out his phone and quickly searched, "How to help a starving kitten." His fingers moved fast, eyes scanning through the articles. Keep it warm. Offer food in small amounts. Check for dehydration. Food. Right. He had to get it to eat. His heart pounded as he got up and tiptoed toward the door, listening for any movement outside. His parents thought the kitten was in the garage. If they caught him now, it would be over. Holding his breath, he slipped into the hallway and made his way to the kitchen. The fridge light cast a pale glow over the dark room as he pulled it open. His eyes darted across the shelves. What could kittens even eat? Milk. That made sense, right? He grabbed the carton and hesitated. Didn't some people say milk was bad for cats? He checked his phone again. Cow's milk isn't ideal, but in emergencies, diluted warm milk can work for weak kittens. That was good enough for now. Moving quickly, he poured a small amount into a cup and added warm water from the tap. Then he dug through the kitchen drawers until he found what he was looking for, a medicine dropper. Perfect. Back in his room, Max sat on the bed and carefully lifted the kitten into his hands. It was still cold, but at least it was breathing. "All right, little guy," he whispered. "You need to drink this." He gently placed the dropper against the kitten's lips and squeezed a single drop into its mouth. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the kitten licked its tiny tongue over its lips. Max held his breath. Encouraged, he gave it another drop. This time, the kitten swallowed. A tiny flicker of hope sparked in Max's chest. Bit by bit, he continued, giving the kitten the milk in the smallest amounts. It wasn't much, but after a few minutes, the kitten finally made a soft sound, something almost like a sigh. Max exhaled in relief. Maybe, just maybe, he could pull this off. But then he noticed something else. The kitten's gums were dry. His stomach tightened. Another quick search confirmed his fear: dehydration. It was one of the most dangerous things for a weak kitten. If it didn't get enough fluids, it wouldn't make it. Max felt panic rising. He needed to get it to drink more. Dipping his finger into the milk mixture, he gently dabbed it against the kitten's lips. The tiny pink tongue flicked out again, but it was so weak. Too weak. What if this wasn't enough? The thought made his chest tighten. He spent the next hour carefully feeding the kitten, pausing to warm it against his skin. Every few minutes, he would check to see if it was responding more. But it remained dangerously still. And then, just as he started to feel a little hopeful, the kitten's breathing changed. It became labored, uneven. Each inhale sounded heavier, as if even breathing had become too hard. Max's heart clenched. "No, no, no," he whispered. His hands trembled as he held the kitten closer, feeling the tiny heartbeat beneath his fingers. It was still there. Still fighting. But for how long? As the night stretched on, Max refused to sleep. He was terrified that if he closed his eyes, the kitten wouldn't wake up. Chapter 4. An Unexpected Helping Hand. Max sat hunched over his bed, the tiny kitten still cradled in his hands. Its breathing was shallow, uneven, and with each strained inhale, his own chest tightened. He had done everything he could, kept it warm, given it milk, tried to keep it hydrated. But the kitten was barely holding on. He couldn't do this alone. A thought flickered in his mind. Mrs. Thompson. She lived in the apartment next door, an older woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. She was always outside, feeding stray cats that lingered around their building. If anyone would know what to do, it was her. Max hesitated only a second before gently wrapping the kitten in a soft towel and tucking it into the front pocket of his hoodie. He slipped on his sneakers and cracked open his bedroom door, listening. Silence. His parents were still asleep. Moving carefully, he tiptoed out of his room and down the hallway. The cool morning air greeted him as he stepped outside and knocked quietly on Mrs. Thompson's door. A few moments later, the door creaked open, and she appeared, her silver hair pulled into a loose bun. She blinked at him in surprise. "Max, what are you doing here so early?" "I need help," he blurted. "Please." Her eyes flickered with concern. "Come in, dear." He stepped inside, pulling the kitten from his hoodie. Mrs. Thompson's expression softened instantly, but when she saw how still the kitten was, her face darkened. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, gently touching the tiny creature. "This little one is in bad shape." "I've been trying to feed it," Max said quickly. "Keeping it warm, giving it milk. But it's not enough, is it?" She shook her head. "It needs urgent care, Max. This kitten is dehydrated and malnourished. If we don't act fast, it won't make it." Max swallowed hard. "Then what do I do?" Mrs. Thompson met his eyes. "It needs a vet. Right away." His stomach twisted. He knew she was right. But how was he supposed to convince his parents? They already said no. "Unless. I'll make them understand," he said, more to himself than to her. Mrs. Thompson gave him a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder. "Good boy. Be strong. This little one needs you." Max's heart pounded as he stood in the kitchen, facing his parents. He had woken them up the moment he got home, refusing to let them brush him off. Now, he clutched the kitten protectively, his voice firm. "I need to take it to a vet." His parents exchanged a glance. His mother sighed. "Max, we talked about this. I know you care, but it's dying, Mom." His voice cracked. "Please." His father rubbed his temples. "Max, even if we take it, there's no guarantee." "But there's a chance," Max cut in. "And I have to try. You always tell me to take responsibility for my actions. Well, I am. Just give me a chance." His mother hesitated, looking at the fragile bundle in his arms. A long silence stretched between them. Then she exhaled. "All right," she said finally. "I'll take you." Max nearly sagged in relief. His dad didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue either. That was enough for now. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and fur. The walls were painted a soft blue, and a few people sat in the waiting area with their pets. Max clutched the kitten to his chest, his stomach a tight knot. His mother had filled out the paperwork, and now they waited. A door opened, and a tall man in a white coat stepped out. "Max Carter." Max jumped up. "That's me." The vet nodded and led them into an exam room. "Let's see what we've got here." Max carefully unwrapped the kitten and placed it on the table. The vet's expression grew serious as he examined it, gently checking its tiny ribs, lifting its eyelids, pressing lightly on its gums. Max held his breath. Finally, the vet looked up, his expression grim. "This little one is in critical condition. I won't lie to you, the chances of survival are very low." Max's throat tightened. "But," the vet continued, "if you're willing to fight for it, we'll do everything we can." Max straightened. "I won't give up on it." The vet gave him a small, approving nod. "All right," he said. "Then let's get to work." Chapter 5. hope amid fear. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and something metallic, like the sharp tang of worry that had settled deep in Max's stomach. He watched as the vet filled out a prescription, his pen moving quickly over the paper. "This kitten needs intensive care," the vet said, handing the paper to Max's mom. "He's severely dehydrated and malnourished. He'll need subcutaneous fluids, antibiotics, and a special feeding schedule." Max's head swam with the weight of those words. He had expected medicine, but injections? Special feeding? The vet turned to him. "Are you sure you're ready for this, son?" Max looked down at the tiny creature on the exam table. It was barely more than skin and bones, its dull fur sticking up in uneven patches. But for the first time since he found it, there was a spark of life in its eyes. A weak, fragile spark. He swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes." The vet studied him for a moment, then nodded back. "All right. Then let's get you trained." Back home, Max sat on the floor of his room, watching as his mom prepared the syringe. It was filled with clear liquid, fluid that would go under the kitten's skin to keep it hydrated. His mother hesitated. "Are you sure you want to do this, Max? I can help." But Max shook his head. "I have to learn." Taking a deep breath, he mimicked what the vet had shown him, pinching the loose skin at the kitten's shoulder and carefully inserting the needle. His hands trembled, but he pushed through the fear. The kitten flinched. A tiny, weak protest left its mouth. "I know, little guy," Max murmured. "Just hold on." When the last drop of fluid had gone in, he carefully withdrew the needle and stroked the kitten's head. It was over. For now. The days blurred together into a strict routine of care. Every few hours, Max fed the kitten with a syringe, holding its tiny head up so it wouldn't choke. Every morning and evening, he administered medicine, rubbing its throat gently to help it swallow. It was exhausting. The kitten hated the treatments, writhing weakly whenever Max tried to help. Its tiny, sharp claws scratched at his hands. Some mornings, it barely moved, making Max wonder if all his efforts were for nothing. Doubt crept in like a slow, creeping shadow. Was he really helping? Or just prolonging the inevitable? One night, after another frustrating attempt to get the kitten to eat, Max sat on the floor beside the makeshift bed he had made for it. His shoulders slumped. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted softly. The kitten didn't respond. It was curled up tightly, its breath slow and uneven. Max let out a shaky sigh. Maybe his parents had been right. Maybe he had taken on more than he could handle. But then, a sound. A tiny, raspy meow. Max's heart leaped as he looked down. The kitten had lifted its head, its dull eyes blinking up at him. And then, it wobbled toward the dish of softened food beside it. Max froze, hardly daring to breathe as the kitten sniffed the food. And then, weakly, hesitantly, it took a bite. Max's heart soared. "You're eating," he whispered, his exhaustion vanishing in an instant. "You're really eating." But then, the kitten suddenly stiffened. Its tiny body tensed. And then, to Max's horror, it started gasping for air. Chapter 6. A Test of Strength. The world blurred around Max as panic gripped his chest. The kitten wasn't breathing. Its tiny body convulsed, its mouth opening and closing soundlessly. A terrible wheezing sound escaped its throat, as if it were choking on something too big for its fragile body to handle. Max's breath hitched. "No, no, no. Moem." His voice cracked as he scrambled to his feet, nearly knocking over the food dish. "Mom, help." Footsteps pounded down the hall. His mother burst into the room, her eyes widening at the sight of him hunched over the tiny creature. "What happened?" she demanded. Max could barely get the words out. It was eating and then this." He gestured helplessly to the struggling kitten. His mother didn't hesitate. She knelt beside him, reaching out with steady hands. "It's choking," she said. "We need to clear its airway." Max watched, heart hammering, as she gently tipped the kitten forward, rubbing its back in slow, careful strokes. The kitten let out a weak cough, and then a tiny piece of half-chewed food dropped onto the blanket. Max gasped as the kitten suddenly inhaled, its tiny sides expanding with a shaky, rattling breath. Its body sagged, exhausted but alive. Max didn't realize he was shaking until his mother put a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay," she said softly. "You saved it." But relief didn't come. Instead, doubt slithered into his mind, cold and unforgiving. Did I cause this? Did I feed it wrong? Was this my fault? His mother seemed to sense his thoughts. "Max," she said gently, "you're doing everything you can. The fact that it's still alive is because of you." Still, the fear lingered. What if next time, he couldn't save it? That night, Max lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The kitten slept beside him, curled into a tiny bowl, its breath steady but faint. Doubt whispered in his mind. Maybe Mom was right. Maybe I'm not ready for this. Maybe I should have let someone else take care of it. But then he remembered. The way the kitten had lifted its head earlier. The way it had tried to eat on its own. The way it had fought, even in its weakest state. And suddenly Max realized, he couldn't give up now. Not when the kitten was trying so hard to survive. Not when they had come this far. He clenched his fists. "I won't stop. Not until you're better." The next morning, as soft light filtered through the curtains, Max opened his eyes to the sound of rustling. His heart jumped. The kitten was moving. Not just shifting in its sleep. Moving. Max sat up just in time to see the tiny creature push itself onto shaky legs. Its paws wobbled beneath its frail body, but it didn't fall. It took one slow, unsteady step forward. Then another. And then it looked up at Max. Something caught in his throat. He reached out, barely breathing, as the kitten took one more step, this time toward him. For the first time since he had found it in that dark, cold basement, there was no fear in its tired little eyes. Only trust. Max felt something warm spread through his chest, stronger than doubt, stronger than fear. They were going to make it. Chapter 7. Trust, Step by Step. The change was slow, but undeniable. Each morning, Max woke to find the kitten a little stronger, a little steadier. It no longer needed to be fed through a syringe. Instead, it approached the small dish of soft food on its own, its tiny pink tongue lapping at the mush with careful determination. Max watched, pride swelling in his chest. "You're really doing it," he thought. "You're fighting." But there were still signs of fear. The first time Max accidentally dropped a book near its bed, the kitten bolted under his desk so fast it was as if it had vanished. Its little body trembled in the shadows, its ears flattened tight against its skull. Max knelt beside the desk, keeping his voice soft. "It's okay," he murmured. "No one's going to hurt you." The kitten didn't move. Max sighed. It wasn't just loud noises. Sometimes, when he reached for it too quickly, it flinched as if expecting pain. He needed to show the kitten that it was safe now. That afternoon, he worked on making the kitten a proper space of its own. He found an old cardboard box and lined it with the softest blanket he could spare. Then he placed a small stuffed toy inside, one he hadn't played with in years but had always found comforting as a kid. After some thought, he added an old t-shirt of his, hoping his scent would make the space feel familiar. When he gently placed the kitten inside, it sniffed around cautiously before curling up into the fabric. A small weight lifted from Max's chest. Maybe this will help. That night, as Max lay in bed, he felt a tiny movement near his arm. The kitten had climbed onto his pillow, its small body pressing lightly against his shoulder. Max barely dared to breathe. He turned his head slowly, meeting two sleepy, wary eyes. Then, a sound. Soft. Barely there. A vibration against the sheets. Max's breath caught. Purring. For the first time, the kitten was purring. Carefully, he reached out and ran his fingers over its head, feeling the faint rumble grow stronger beneath his touch. A warm, indescribable feeling filled Max's chest. "You're safe now," he whispered. "I promise." As the days passed, the kitten grew braver. It started playing, batting at bits of string and chasing after his fingers. Sometimes it even pounced, though its movements were still clumsy. But then, just as quickly, it would freeze. Something unseen would startle it, and it would dart into the shadows, pressing itself low to the ground, shaking. The first few times, Max thought it was just instinct. Maybe it was still getting used to its new home. But then, one evening, as he was gently stroking its fur, his fingers brushed over something he hadn't noticed before. A rough patch. No, a scar. His stomach twisted. Carefully, he pushed back the soft fur. And his heart clenched. There were several scars. Faint but unmistakable. Someone had hurt this kitten before. Max swallowed hard, a mix of anger and sorrow swelling in his chest. Who could do this? He looked down at the small, fragile creature curled up beside him. No wonder it flinched. No wonder it feared hands reaching toward it. Max clenched his fists. Whoever had hurt it before, that life was over now. He would make sure of it. Chapter 8. A secret past. Max couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that lingered in his chest after discovering the scars. Who had done this? How long had the kitten suffered before he found it? The questions gnawed at him all morning. That afternoon, while helping his neighbor Mrs. Thompson carry groceries inside, he decided to ask. She was always the first to know everything that happened in their building. "Mrs. Thompson," he began hesitantly, "do you know if there were stray cats in the basement?" The old woman set down a bag and sighed. "Oh yes. There were quite a few," she said. "The building manager didn't want them down there, said they were making a mess. A few weeks ago, they chased them all out." Max stiffened. Chased them out, how? She hesitated. "Some people tried scaring them away with loud noises, but I heard that a few were, well, treated poorly." She lowered her voice. "Some folks don't have kindness in their hearts, dear." His stomach twisted. Was that what happened to the kitten? Had it been hurt when they cleared the basement? He swallowed hard, his hands clenching into fists. He didn't know who was responsible, but that didn't matter anymore. The kitten was his now. And no one, was ever going to hurt it again. That evening, Max sat beside the kitten, gently scratching behind its ears. "I don't know what happened to you before," he murmured, watching its tiny body relax into his touch. "But I swear, you're safe now." The kitten slowly blinked up at him. For the first time, there was no hesitation. No fear. Just quiet trust. A warmth spread through Max's chest. But the moment was short-lived. Suddenly, the kitten shuddered. Its tiny body tensed, and a soft, pained sound escaped its throat. Max frowned. "Hey, are you okay?" He touched its fur. And his heart nearly stopped. The kitten was burning up. Panic flared in his chest. Just hours ago, it had been fine. What was happening? Max carefully scooped the kitten into his hands, feeling its frail body tremble. Think. The vet had told him what to do if something went wrong. But, was this serious? Was it another illness? Was it something he had missed? His mind raced, fear creeping in. He had fought so hard to save it. Was he about to lose it now? Chapter 9. Near the finish line. Max didn't hesitate. Clutching the trembling kitten to his chest, he ran out the door, barely stopping to shove his feet into his sneakers. His heart pounded wildly, his breath coming in short gasps as he sprinted down the street. Just hold on. Please hold on. The vet's clinic was only a few blocks away, but tonight, it felt like miles. Every second stretched unbearably long as he rushed through the dark streets, the kitten's small, burning hot body pressed against his hoodie. By the time he burst through the clinic doors, he was breathless, his voice cracking as he called out, "Help! It's my kitten. He's burning up." Dr. Ramirez, the kind-eyed veterinarian who had helped before, was already reaching for the kitten, her face serious as she placed it on the exam table. Max stood frozen, his hands balled into fists. "What's happening?" His voice was barely a whisper. Is he going to be okay?" Dr. Ramirez gently pressed her fingers against the kitten's frail body, checking its pulse, then listening with her stethoscope. Finally, she exhaled and looked up. "He's weak, Max. His immune system is still fragile. Sometimes, when an animal has been starved for too long, their body struggles to fight even the smallest infection." Max swallowed hard, his stomach twisting into knots. "Can we do anything?" She nodded. "We'll give him fluids, some antibiotics. He has a chance, Max. But you need to be prepared, it might be a rough night." Rough was an understatement. Max refused to leave the kitten's side. Back home, he set up a small space near his bed, placing the kitten on the softest blanket he owned. He sat beside it, stroking its fur, whispering every comforting word he could think of. The hours crawled by. At times, the kitten barely moved, its tiny chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. Max felt his own exhaustion creeping in. His eyes stung from the lack of sleep, his head heavy. But he didn't dare close his eyes. He had to stay awake. He had to be there. "Please," he whispered into the quiet of the room. "Please don't give up." The first rays of dawn crept through the curtains, bathing the room in soft light. Max barely noticed. His body ached from sitting hunched over all night, his mind clouded with worry. And then, a small, warm pressure against his hand. Max blinked. The kitten had shifted. It was weak, so weak, but it had moved. And then, with a tiny, hesitant motion, it pressed its nose against his fingers. Max sucked in a breath. It was the smallest sign. A mere flicker of life. But it was there. A tiny spark of fight, of determination. And Max knew, in that moment, the kitten wanted to live. Chapter 10. A new chapter in life. It had been a few days since that long, terrifying night when the kitten had teetered so close to the edge. Now, the change was miraculous. Max watched with awe as the kitten, no longer the fragile, sickly creature he had found in the basement, zipped across the room with newfound energy. It pounced on toys, its tiny paws batting at strings and soft balls. Each movement was full of life, full of joy. Max laughed softly, feeling a warmth in his chest as the kitten tumbled over a toy mouse and then scurried to pick it up again. "You're getting fast," Max said, his voice full of affection. "I'll have to watch out for you soon." The kitten paused for a moment, then pounced again, landing squarely on the mouse, and looked up at Max with wide, playful eyes. That afternoon, his parents finally saw what Max had been doing. They had been quiet observers for the past week, but now, it was impossible not to notice the changes. His mom leaned against the doorframe, watching as Max carefully fed the kitten, ensuring it was well fed and comfortable. His dad, usually so busy with work, sat down beside Max, their eyes meeting as the kitten curled up contentedly in his lap. Max could see the understanding in their eyes, the recognition of how hard he had worked, how much he had fought for the little life that now depended on him. "Max," his mom said softly, "you've really done it. You've brought him back." Max smiled shyly, but his heart swelled with pride. "I had to. He was too weak. I couldn't just let him go." His dad nodded, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We see that now. You've shown a lot of responsibility. It's clear how much he means to you." Max's breath caught. Did this mean? "We'll allow him to stay," his dad continued. "You've earned it." Max's eyes widened. "Really? Really?" his mom agreed. "You've proven you can care for him. He's yours now." Max looked down at the kitten, who had curled up on his lap and was now purring contentedly. His heart swelled with gratitude, and he knew with absolute certainty that this was the beginning of something beautiful. He reached down and stroked the kitten's soft fur, thinking carefully. "You're not just any kitten," Max whispered. You're my Chance. The kitten let out a soft meow, as if acknowledging the name. From that moment on, the little cat was called Chance, a symbol of the life he had fought so hard to protect, and of the new chapter they would begin together. Over the next few months, Chance became an inseparable part of the family. Max's parents saw the changes in him as well. The way he had grown more responsible, more patient, and more confident. He was no longer the quiet boy who spent hours lost in his books. Now, he was the young man who cared for a life, who understood the depth of what it meant to nurture something so fragile and precious. Chance played freely throughout the house, often curling up beside Max at night, purring softly as they both drifted off to sleep. They had formed a bond that nothing could break. And as Max watched Chance, now healthy and full of life, curled up on his lap, he understood something deeply. The love and care he had given to the little kitten had made him stronger, had opened his heart to the power of compassion. He had learned that sometimes, in saving another life, you end up saving your own. Max looked down at Chance and smiled. "We did it," he whispered. The kitten, now comfortable and content, gave a tiny stretch before snuggling closer. Max's heart swelled. A kind heart can save a life. And that was the greatest lesson of all.